wanted to thank the Piscataway people on whose land we stand, and also the very patient people at JVP when I missed every conference call appointment. So much apologies, but it's just great to be here in this exciting group of people doing such amazing work. So I thought I would just start from a quote I'm sure we've heard many times, but pretty much summarizes everything. This is from Benny Morris, an Israeli historian. Quote, "I feel sympathy for the Palestinian people, which truly underwent a hard tragedy. I feel sympathy for the refugees themselves. But if the desire to establish a Jewish state here is legitimate, there was no other choice but to expel the Palestinian population, to uproot it in the course of war. Even the great American democracy could not have been created without the annihilation of the Indians. There are cases in which the overall final good justifies harsh and cruel acts that are committed in the course of history." So this is pretty much our problem today. But the one problem that I want to focus on is the manner in which when we organize around what's going on in Israel, that we can frame it in kind of an Israeli exceptionalism, right? A focus on this is the violence of the Israeli state that somehow normalizes the violence of other states, particularly this United States. And if you were to look at really a lot of our liberation struggles, which are often framed as freedom will come when we have a nation state, right, that we can be self-determining but at the expense of others that are not self-determining, then actually Israel is the natural goal of our liberation struggles, right? If we were to win power, this is what we would end up with. And I see this a lot of times when I'll ask Native people, I say, to be honest, if the U.S. were to disappear tomorrow, would we be much better off? And everybody will say, no, just with our tribal governance systems, right? We're not actually running things differently. Even on a micro level, I will, at my school at UC Riverside, I'll ask students, what do they think about UCR and the academic industrial complex? And they'll have a very long list of complaints and how miserable and unhappy they are. So I'll say, okay, tomorrow you get to take over UC Riverside. How are you going to do things differently? And they invariably say, we wouldn't do anything differently because we don't know what else we could do, right? So consequently, when we think about kind of decolonization, I think it forces us to not only rethink what we think decolonization is, but to also rethink what exactly is colonization. That is, we tend to equate colonization simply with the theft of land and resources, and hence decolonization is simply about getting land back. But what I want to suggest is that colonization is not simply about the theft of land, but it is actually the creation of something called land that can then be stolen. Right? The colonization requires the creation of a distinction between humanity and land that must become a meaningful distinction to begin with, such that land can then become a commodity that can be owned and controlled by one group of people. To quote Joseph Puglisi, he kind of frames it this way: the lived violence of Native peoples is encapsulated by the fact that they are, quote, under the jurisdiction of a department that otherwise manages natural resources, or the Department of Interior. And the legal origin in the United States of which Native peoples become categorized as natural resources can be found in the doctrine of discovery in the Johnson versus McIntosh decision, in which the court held that indigenous peoples have the right to occupancy, but they cannot hold title to the land because the European nation that discovered the land had the right to legal title. Native peoples were disqualified from being discoverers because they did not work. Quote, the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose occupation was war and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forest. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country in the wilderness. Because Native peoples could not work, they had the ontological status of things to be discovered, the status of nature. Thus, work is not simply about a prior category in which people can engage in, but work is what creates humanity in the first place. Native peoples then fundamentally disqualified from the category of humanity. Similarly, if you look at the Lowe versus United States decision, in which it was held that Native nations could not leave the U.S. without the permission of the U.S., the reason is that Native legal status was decided as status under disability, which actually overlaps with a similar manner in which people with disabilities are disqualified from being workers and hence disqualified from the category of humanity. So if we look at a lot of worker or labor protection laws, they don't apply to people with disabilities, particularly those working in shelter workshops, because what they do is ontologically not defined as work, right? It is defined as rehabilitation. So when people with disabilities try to organize against Goodwill Industries, they lost because the court held that they were not working, and hence they did not deserve worker protection. So, when we look at the school-to-prison pipeline today, it is not a surprise to us to find that a third of Native and Black students with disabilities will be suspended or expelled, right? Because school is that which is supposed to produce workers. If you cannot ontologically become a worker, school is not ultimately supposed to be for you. And of course, as we know the statistics, if you are suspended or expelled, you're 3 times more likely to end up in the criminal justice system within a year, and 5 times more likely to end up dropping out of school altogether. And this is because you're not ultimately seen as somebody who can work. So hence, and where I live, actually in San Bernardino, the statistics are higher. 59% of Black male students will be, with disabilities will be suspended or expelled, and 50% of Native students. So consequently, we have, because people are ontologically defined as non-workers, they are ontologically defined as disposable. So consequently, with this requires us to rethink not, again, just our relationship with land, but how did land become created as a thing to begin with. We have to essentially discuss the connection between raciality and the thingification as nature. And one of the problems we have in framing decolonization as always being something about a land-based struggle is that we don't then challenge the category of land. So for instance, when there's encroachment on indigenous lands, the only thing you can say in this legal system is, it's not your land, it's our land. You don't get to ask the question, well, why should the land be anybody's at all? Right? Why should it be a commodity that can be owned and controlled by one group of peoples? Shouldn't all peoples be living in a relationship with all of creation and care for it? As Patricia Montour-Angus puts it, quote, although Aboriginal peoples maintain a close relationship with the land, it is not about control of the land. Earth is mother and she nurtures us all. It is the human race that is dependent on the earth and not vice versa. Sovereignty, when defined as my right to be responsible, requires a relationship with territory and not a relationship based on control of that territory. What must be understood then is that the Aboriginal request to have our sovereignty respected is really a request to be responsible. I don't know of anywhere else in history where a group of people have had to fight so hard just to be responsible. And Diane Millian extends this further and says the problem may even be in the word land, right? Really, if you think about it, our relationships are with all of the biosphere, with all of creation. And land becomes a way of truncating all these complex relationships into a thing that we can then later commodify. So really, we're talking about even more than land, but how we exist in radical relationality with everybody and all of creation. So consequently, many indigenous struggles are saying we need to take this a further step forward when we think about decolonization. For instance, at the World Social Forum in 2008, indigenous peoples in Latin America were saying the number one question we want to put on the table is the question of the nation state. We don't think it's worked for the last 500 years, so we don't think it's going to start working now. But they said our goal isn't, again, to say everybody else go home, whatever that means, right? Rather, our thing is we can all be here, but we need to be different, right? We need to understand ourselves in radical relationality with all peoples and all land, all creation, all of nature, so that we can create communities that will be sustainable over the long term. And essentially, they were posing decolonization as an epistemological problem, right? And Denise DeSilva's work, I think, also speaks to this. That is, kind of under Western philosophy, the self knows who it is because you're not somebody else, right? I know who I am because I'm not you. So if I understand myself in this exclusivist way, then obviously the nations that I build from that sense of self will also be exclusive. Right? I know what my nation is because it's not your nation. I must defend my nation against your nation. But if I see myself that I am who I am because of you, right? I am going because of my relationships with you and all everything. Then my sense of nation will also be inclusive, right? My nation will exist in relationship to all other nations, with all people, with all creations. It will be open, inclusive, rather than exclusive. So consequently, many movements that are saying it's not enough to fight against what we don't like. We have to actually know what we want, right? If the systems were to disappear tomorrow, we don't want to just recreate the same systems again. We have to have something to actually replace it with. We need new forms of government that are based on different principles of mutual respect, responsibility, interconnectedness, rather than violence, domination, and control. So the goal kind of these movements is to say, and this is what I learned from folks in Chiapas, they said, well, originally we thought we could kind of get our guns and take over the state, and then we realized they have a lot more guns than we do. But second of all, if we do that, we would just create another nation state, right? Instead, they said, well, what if we started to create the world we want to live in now? What if we started to create our own healthcare systems, our own governance systems, our own healthcare systems? And most importantly, it wouldn't be enough to just build kind of a cool, groovy, hippie commune zone, right? That wouldn't necessarily do anything, but what if we started to proliferate these zones? And so they build, and build. Eventually, well, if we started to live differently, what could all the money and the guns do, right? If we refuse to invest in the system when we have our own system that squeezed out the current system, we could actually build the world we want to live in now. And I'll just give one example kind of on a smaller scale. In Arizona, the Out of Your Backpack Media, which is an indigenous youth media organization, this is one of their principles. This is their ground rules. No drugs, alcohol, racism, heteropatriarchy, colonialism, neoliberalism, hierarchy, capitalism, and no drama. But I mention this example because, again, they're creating colonization, decolonization in a very expansive way. And what's noteworthy, I think, about them is that they've actually developed a very sophisticated system for addressing gender violence within their community. And this isn't a group that developed all the anti-violence movement. It's a media program, but they started to see that they could not have decolonization unless they also had gender justice. And so they developed a whole system for how they could address gender violence without having to rely upon the state, that they themselves would be accountable and ensure justice for survivors, and to ensure that gender violence would not be happening in these places, and that just became part of how they envisioned decolonization. I'd like to mention another quote, this is going to be a longer quote from Koya Artichoker, but she talked about what would it mean if we kind of got out of the politics of recognition. So let me just kind of briefly mention the problem here. So this is global oppression, which you can't see, but it's a pyramid system. We have 5% of the population that owns 95% of the wealth. The bad news is they have all the money and the guns. But the good news is there's a lot more of us than them, right? But the catch is we actually need to get the 95% mobilized. However, the state being the sneaky thing that it is, will come to a group and say, indigenous group, you look very oppressed to us, and you look very cool, interesting, and spiritual as well. Prove how oppressed you are, we will recognize you. We'll give you land, resources. Of course, this other group also looks very oppressed. We think they may be more oppressed than you. We might recognize them instead of you, right? So we start becoming locked into this competition for recognition. We have to be the group that gets recognized. And we call this decolonization, but actually we're fighting for recognition because we actually depend upon the colonial powers to recognize us. And instead of being able to build a movement, we're in competition with each other. Instead of trying to recognize each other, we're trying to get the system to recognize us, and hence we do not develop the mutual recognition that would allow us to build a different system. So Koya Artichoker kind of said, well, what would it mean if we were to stop thinking beyond the politics of vanishing and scarcity, right? Instead of having to prove how unique we are, to prove that we are the last remnants of cool indigenous peoples that exist, that need to be recognized, what if we reimagine indigeneity from the perspective of power? What if we started to see it as something that can actually kind of transform the world? And this is what was noteworthy to me during the World Social Forum, is that the people that were making these statements were saying, we are literally facing extinction in a generation. We could literally go extinct in a generation, and yet they said, we're not here just to fight for ourselves, we're here to change the world. Right? They imagine themselves from a position of power rather than extinction. So she puts it this way, in kind of talking about the tendency within some Native communities to define indigeneity so narrowly. She says, we believe it is an outgrowth of colonialism that an individualistic American sense of identity, one that seeks to overpower and erase the culture of kindness and kinship our community can offer when at its best has taken root in our modern culture. At its worst, we've seen assertions made on our behalf that some have a more legitimate claim to our shared ancestry than others. The weight of atrocities such as the transatlantic slave trade and the pillaging and plundering of our continental resources and lands for the gain of a European monarchies, nations, and New World capitalists are to this day rearing on our ground and in our bones. Because of those parallel and overlapping oppressions that indigenous, mestizo, black, African, and Caribbean peoples have endured, our stake in each other's survival is greater than we have ever been led to believe. Our ancestors wept together at the loss of our homelands, at the loss of our mothers and fathers, our lovers and our babies, our sacred practices and rituals, at the loss of our autonomy and histories. As people of resistance and resilience, however, we know that not all has been lost. And it has been part of our shared spiritual imperative to continue to reclaim our ancestry, our languages, and our claims to each other as kin. It is through this reclaiming that we see glimmers of what is possible, what promises lie on the other side of our shame and our grief, when we unbind ourselves from the lie that there is a singular indigenous experience, a singular claim of who we are and what constitutes our communities. We have the opportunity now more than ever to see the full depth and breadth of who we are as shared descendants of the American continent and tribal nations, of the Antilles Indians and Africans brought to the Caribbean and the continent as slaves. We are indigenous. So in looking at this, kind of rethinking kind of colonization beyond rethinking our relationship to land, the other thing, as I mentioned before, is that I think it poses an epistemological challenge. In particular, it forces us to look at the way colonization operates, not just to take away land and resources, but to colonize our imaginations, as to limit what we think is even possible. I think we heard that yesterday when we talked about the elections being kind of the illusion of choice. But again, that's true in the United States as well, right? You know what I'm saying? Right? But we just don't think that anything can ever be possible. So I'm just going to make one quote. This isn't to pick on this particular person in particular, but more to say I think this is often emblematic of sometimes what we see in the BDS movement. This is from Max Blumenthal, who kind of phrases how he looks at the relationship between settler colonialism in Palestine and Israel. He said, quote, "Why are you as an American covering the situation and focusing on it 5,000 miles away? Isn't the United States a settler colonial state, and what are you doing about that?" Question mark. This is an important question, and his answer is, well, one of the issues, though, is that the process of settler colonialism that brought the United States and Canada into being is largely a completed project. By contrast, Palestinian resistance is ongoing and the process of settler colonialism is still going on. They want to finish the project that began in 1948, and I as a journalist feel it's my obligation to document what's happening and to get in the way. If I were a journalist in the 1880s, I would hope that I would have been in the American West documenting those final massacres of the Lakota Sioux. Now I find this a little disturbing. But one is that, again, the premise that colonialism in the U.S. is settled. But two, it seems to assume that the colonization of Palestine will eventually also be settled, right? And I think that the reason why we end up in this position is that perhaps we feel like we're kind of a minority voice, crying out in the wilderness, like, yeah, sure, if you live in the Bay Area, sometimes you can feel like, hey, maybe we'll do this because other people kind of do this. But when you're trying to argue this in Oklahoma, right, you have a different feeling about your prospects. right? The righteous remnant who will declare things even though we don't feel like we can actually even win. But two things I think need to be stressed here. First of all is, one, we don't imagine that we could win. We don't imagine if we won what that would actually be. Okay, so be quiet soon. Okay, but one, I think that if we don't have an imagination of what we want, how do we know if we're even getting there, right? So I think sometimes we tend to frame this imagination as impractical. We often have this divide. Are you a reformist or a revolutionary, right? If you're a revolutionary, you got good politics, but you're impractical. If you're a reformist, you're practical, but you're a sellout. But I think we have to see that two have to go hand in hand. Right? We have to do practical things to ensure people's survivals now, but we want to make sure that our strategies are actually working. And if we don't know what we're trying to get to, we don't know if they're working. I remember I was at an anti-violence conference one time. We were asked the question, what would you like to see in 20 years? And everybody said things like more hotlines and more shelters, and nobody said less violence. We actually forgot why we joined the anti-violence movement. And if we remember, we would have done some of our strategies a long time ago because they weren't leading to less violence. But second of all, I think the other thing that happens here is because we can't imagine winning, we don't think how we could win. So to bring us back to our handy diagram, when we look at this 95% and we see these folks, we will find that there are many annoying people here.
I see it.
You know, they have bad politics, they don't like your religion, they don't like pink-haired yogurt, which is awful. Oh, sorry. But the catch is we actually have to talk to them, right? And to do that, we have to reframe the issue so that we can have that conversation. And so when we feel like we're in the embattled minority, instead of thinking that as a point of weakness, it can be a point of strength. Because then we're clear about what we're dealing with, and we're more likely to try to reframe issues and organize to actually get the 95% mobilized. And this is where Native peoples, I think, have particular insight because many times they're working in areas where everybody around you hates you, right? You're a small minority of the population, and yet you have to get people who hate you to actually side with you. And yet Native peoples have had some of the major victories here against Exxon in Wisconsin, against Kerr McGee, kicking out the company that was responsible for 25% of the uranium in the United States. And they did that because they engaged in what they call Cowboys and Indians coalitions, not assuming a permanent enemy that they can never work with. And in our current nonprofit industrial complex model, we often organize around the permanent enemy, right? The permanent enemy is people who back Israel. The permanent enemy is people who are pro-life. The permanent enemy is the Christian right, etc. But as long as entire groups of people become the permanent enemy, we can never be mobilized to build the mass movement we need to actually change the system. Similarly, I do a lot of work around this, particularly in conservative evangelical communities. And you may not be aware, but there's actually a major evangelical movement against the policies of Israel. And some are more visible. I'll mention one group, Killjoy Prophets. But there's also groups that you're never going to see them signing on to anything, but they're going to Southern Baptist Church, to Southern Baptist Church, to Southern Baptist Church. They're taking people to Palestine, showing what's actually going on, and kind of church by church, changing the overall vision of what's happening. And this can actually work. To give you one example, how was it that almost every Christian right organization changed their position on immigration within the space of a few years? That was because, I don't know if you know that happened, but that did happen, right? Like, most conservatives changed their position on immigration because two evangelical women of color said, we can do this. And they developed a very sophisticated, expansive organizing campaign that got every group to change their position. And similarly, in evangelicalism, there's similar switches that are happening. Let me just quote from one statement that was made by 58 evangelical leaders to George Bush in 2002. And include actually many mainstream evangelical leaders that said, we encourage you to move boldly forward so that the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian peoples are assured by vigorously opposing injustice, including the continued unlawful and degrading Israeli settlement movement. The theft of Palestinian land, the destruction of Palestinian homes and fields is surely one of the major causes of the strife that has resulted in terrorism and the loss of so many lives. The continued Israeli military occupation that daily humiliates ordinary Palestinian peoples is having a disastrous effect on the Israeli soul. Mr. President, the American evangelical community is not monolithic, flock in full and firm support of present Israeli policy. And then give one quote here from Killjoy Prophets. Let's give Bethlehem, the land of Jesus' birth for Christmas, Jesus' birth, a gift this year. Let's resolve in 2015 to speak truth to power. Standing on the sideline and shaking our heads as Christians for United for Israel, CUFI, supports the destruction of Palestinian communities is unacceptable, and for that we must repent. Palestinian Christians have discerned it is time for us to change and ask for our help. We as Christians who love justice and seek shalom owe this to all Palestinians regardless of their faith. Let's begin a movement to speak strongly to CUFI. This stand will take courage, but the world, especially the Christians in Bethlehem, ask if you have faith in the face of empire. So, what this essentially tells us is that we can't assume where people stand. One time I was moving, and the mover turned out to be this big conservative Southern Baptist, and he got very perplexed by my books. So you seem to have all these Southern Baptist books, who are you anyway? So this got into this discussion about Israel, and he said, this is my big concern. Churches are actively supporting Israel, but I want to know what's happening to Palestinians. I'm very concerned about this. We had an hour-long discussion, and he was resolved to do something about that situation in his church. But that, we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't started the conversation, if we hadn't made that kind of assumption. So essentially the revolution starts with the conversation. So finally I'll just conclude by saying, what if we were to kind of change our positions and imagine we will actually end colonialism, both in the U.S., Palestine, and everywhere? What if we imagine that we can create a different governance system that ensures justice for all people and all creation? And what if we imagine this can actually happen? This is something we can do. How would our organizing look differently? And I'll just end with a quote from Dylan Rodriguez, who puts it this way. Our job is to think the unthinkable, imagine the unimaginable, and make the impossible a reality. Thank you.